Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the National Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about sex positivity. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me, I have returning Dr. Amber Norman. Dr. Norman uses she, her pronouns and is a licensed mental health counselor and a visiting professor at the University of Central Florida. Her clinical practice supports ethnic and sexual minorities with a specialty in BDSM. So Dr. Norman, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast. Super excited to have you as always.
Thank you for having me.
And I also have returning Danielle Simpson-Baker. Danielle uses she, her pronouns and is a crisis counselor and victim advocate at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. So when Danielle was on this podcast previously, she wasn't at the VSC and now she is. So that's really exciting. And Danielle actually recently graduated with a master's in marriage and couples therapy from UCF and is currently a registered marriage and family therapy intern. She is also working toward a dual certificate in sex therapy and education. She provides free and inclusive sex education on her Instagram page, which is the Sex Pot Therapist. So Danielle, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast. Super excited to have you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
As a really brief introduction, the previous episode that both of you were on, we were talking about the BDSM community and consent. And this week, I'm super excited to chat with you about sex positivity. So today, we will be talking about enthusiastic consent, ways to communicate triggers and boundaries with our partners, and how sex positivity can actually help combat rape culture. So with that, I would love to start off with some definitions like I usually do. So could you define sex positivity and things that come to mind when you hear this word? And anyone can jump in at any time.
All right. Sex positivity. So for me, the first word that comes to mind is pleasure. Okay. I think that for those of us who have been socialized in maybe religious or conservative spaces, we were given sort of a message that sex was negative or this inappropriate form of engagement that if you did it outside of a very rigid construct like heterosexual monogamous marriage, then, it's going to be problematic, right? And I think that part of the cultural expectation around that is that sexuality should be suppressed, or else you're given some negative label, right? Like slut or whore, or fast, loose, any other words that we have used to describe people who enjoy it and who are interested in sex. But as we sort of develop in that sort of negative connotation, we kind of internalize this very limiting idea around sex. And if you feel anything beyond that limit, then we feel bad about ourselves. We judge ourselves. We judge other people. And I think that shame creates a vulnerability for anyone wanting to engage intimately. So when we talk about sex, if we censor that conversation, no one is really safe to express themselves, right? Or learn about themselves or communicate or even consult about that topic, and that not talking and then simply just acting out our deeply repressed feelings can really lead to confusion, harm, misunderstanding, things like that. And so, really, sex positivity starts with having this conversation by simply talking, by having an honest and open dialogue about sex as a human experience. And then from that conversation, then we can start breaking down those negative messages and replace them with more pleasure centered messages. If we think about sex and intimacy as fun and interesting and awkward and generative, then we really can reduce a lot of that shameful association.
I love that. And I think that while you were talking, Dr. Norman, I realized that this can look different across many different cultures. So unless you want to speak to other cultures, I think for the sake of this conversation, I think it's safe to say that we're kind of talking about American culture when it comes to sex positivity today in this episode, unless, correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct. And definitely when I'm talking about sex negativity, I am talking about it from a westernized construct.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Danielle, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to hop in on as far as the definition that Dr. Norman provided.
Yeah, excuse me. I agree with everything Dr. Norman said. For me, something else that comes up is just like not shying away from sex and sexuality. Just in the term sex positivity itself, I think that encourages exploration, wanting to do the research, wanting to find out like what the proper terms are to use for certain things, and not being afraid to find out that information, because I think that information is very empowering, which we'll talk about a little bit later as far as how sex positivity can combat rape culture. And then on top of that, also just being open and accepting of what sexuality means for other people, not just for yourself, but for other people. So whether somebody wants to be like openly slutty or really reserved, that's their right, because that is how they express themselves sexually. So yeah, just keeping in mind that sexuality is different for everybody, but as long as it's not hurting anybody, including the person, then, let it ride.
I love that. And I love you kind of bringing in the idea of expression too. And I also, as we're doing all these different topics on this podcast, there is this underlying reoccurring theme of taking the shame away from these conversations and how important that is. So I appreciate those awesome definitions. So thank you. Danielle, in addition to being a VSC crisis counselor and victim advocate, you also practice sex therapy. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
I can, yeah. So sex therapy is basically therapy for sexual problems. A lot of people, when they hear the words, they think that you're actually like having sex with your clients. So I want to take the time to say that that is not what sex therapy is. Sex therapy is primarily talk therapy. There are modes of sex therapy where it is a little bit more hands-on, but that's not what I do. But yeah, so it's basically talk therapy for your sexual concerns, and it can look like very different things for each client. It just depends on what the client needs. So we can talk about like gender and identity issues. We can talk about sexual dysfunction, communication in the bedroom, outside the bedroom, and how that's affecting your relationships. It can even be just discussions on shame and guilt relating to sexuality, which comes up pretty often. And it can even just be like education on like best practices and techniques and stuff like that. So it's catered to the client, depends on what they need. But yeah, it's been really fun so far. I love it.
That is so interesting. It's just like anything else, people have certain goals and, concerns that they want to bring up. And then you're just kind of there to host those discussions. And I was going to ask you if shame and guilt came up a lot, and it sounds like it did. bring in concept of sex positivity into your practice as a VSC, crisis counselor and beyond?
Definitely. So I had a client recently, and we started talking about, just her ideas about sex and sexuality, and it kind of turned into a conversation about shame and guilt for, being a sexual being in this world, but also growing up with the morals and ideals that she has about sexuality and just like combating that. And it was a really great opportunity to bring sex positivity into our conversation because I kind of, ended up trying to empower her to realize like you're able to make your own decisions about what sex and sexuality means to you and about what being a good person or a bad person in the realm of sexuality means for you. And it was a really cool conversation because I got the impression that no one had ever told her that before, like that no one had ever like told her that she does have the power to make these decisions for herself.
While you were talking, I forgot that, the concepts of, gender expectations when it comes to, sex positivity or shame in our culture is also super important. So I assume that also the addedness of, this idea that women don't enjoy sex as much as men or things like that probably add to that shame, which makes sense why sex positivity, and again, we'll dive more into it, combats rape culture because it breaks down that gender expectation as well. When I was planning this podcast, the idea of enthusiastic consent was always in the back of my mind. So what do people mean when they do say enthusiastic consent? As an educator on sexual violence and things like that, I always bring up like consent has to also be enthusiastic. So when we say that, what do we really mean?
Well, for me, what comes to mind when I think of enthusiastic consent is just very like obvious, undeniable consent, like beyond a shadow of a doubt, like that the person is wanting and willing to engage in, the sexual act with you. And it can be verbal or nonverbal, obviously. But yeah, when it's enthusiastic, like there's no doubt about it. Like, for sure, like, yes, we both want this to go down in this way. And yeah, I think that's it. That's my question.
Absolutely. Dr. Norman, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or how you talk to maybe students or teach about enthusiastic consent?
Yeah, I love the emphasis on clarity, right? And this level of certainty and expectation that Danielle just communicated. I think that's a really important part of the enthusiasm. So I do research on consent. So sometimes I have like from a very sort of clinical or researchy kind of place in very literal terms. I kind of break consent down or describe consent as this shared bilateral agreement, right? In any social interaction. But it must allow for unilateral withdrawal, right? And I think that part is really important. What I mean by that is that, similar to what Danielle said, everyone involved needs to be on the same page. However, anyone may withdraw without risk or penalty. And I think that if we start thinking about consent as that type of open-ended contract, it really gives everyone an opportunity to sort of position themselves within that relationship or within that experience. And it sort of opens the door for us to kind of have those communications and conversations about expectations and needs and desires, things like that. So beyond this sort of basic level of agreement, the enthusiastic consent really does involve that clarity, this active participation in the communication of an interaction, particularly for this conversation, a sexual interaction. And what that looks like for me is really just investing, my ideas, my desires, my limits, my outcomes with confidence, right? And then having that expectation that those conditions are going to be met, right? And I think all of that needs to happen in order for it to be enthusiastic for sure.
Absolutely. I think that it's super important to always bring up the fact that it is something that you can withdraw at any time as well. It's definitely not written in stone. That's not how it works. And I think that I appreciate you also kind of bringing up the individuality of it too, because, enthusiastic consent can look different for a lot of different people, of course. And if you're ever not feeling as excited as you feel like you should be for whatever the interaction is, you have every right to walk away and reconsider at any point during the interaction too. So
Absolutely.
I love talking about enthusiastic consent. I think it's, there's no coercion going on. I like that you also brought up the fact that there's no fear of like penalty for withdrawing as well. And so I love it. Thank you so much for shedding light on that. So we talked a little bit about what consent has to look like, but what else does consent need for it to be consent? So things like identifying needs and desires, maybe some verbal and nonverbal cues. What are some things that, it's interesting how like consent is very clear, but also it has a lot of complicated components to it. And I don't know if there were any specific ones that you wanted to uplift and highlight.
Yeah, I don't mind starting us off with that, sort of digging a little deeper into consent. So I love acronyms, and I don't know if that is just the teacher in me that just likes to simplify really complex concepts into cool little letters. But there's sort of this concept that I refer to as self-unifying negotiation. So it's acronym SUN, SUN. So with self-unifying negotiation, first we begin with ourself, which I think, Emilie, you alluded to just now. But we start with ourself, with our body, our mind. And this first level of consent is really that individual journey that you were just sort of referencing, right? And it's really about us getting curious about our body, our shape, our voice, our sensations, our breath, whatever our needs are. And it's also about giving ourselves permission to explore ourselves with interest and safety, right? And Danielle mentioned that in the beginning in terms of how she's working with clients to really combat some of the cultural scripts, right? In order to give ourselves that permission to get curious about ourselves. Because I really believe that without taking the time to identify what feels good to us, what does not feel good to us, we're going to struggle to really participate fully in our relationships. And that this idea of unifying, the term unified self is really used to describe this kind of balance and organized integration of all of ourselves, our attributes, our needs. It makes space for our habits, our traumas, our relationships, our complexities, all of our feelings. And it really requires that we seek out these experiences or conditions that support us feeling good, right? Like that's how we sort of know that we are engaging consensually, if we know that what we are agreeing to is going to support us feeling good, safe, seen, heard, empowered. And then we take all of that personal data to inform how we negotiate with other people, right? So that self-unifying part is like that first step that then will allow us to negotiate in a really full, holistic, authentic, safe way. Yeah. That's sort of at least how I sort of synthesize the initiation of negotiating and the initiation of consent with others.
Absolutely. And obviously you alluded to it too. We can't have that conversation with ourselves if we're in a culture that shames us to even have these thoughts or even thinking about our desires, things like that. And exactly. So I can totally see why sex positivity really has to come at the forefront for us to start this process, this introspective process. And feel free to jump in at any time, Danielle.
No, of course. Again, I totally on board with everything Dr. Norman just mentioned, and I completely agree. Like, there's levels to consent, and I think that it definitely starts before you get into the bedroom or wherever you're about to, have your time. And I definitely think that self-exploration is essential to being able to consent to anything, because you need to know what feels good to you before you can make sure that you're going to consent to it with another person. So that's why I'm always encouraging, like, especially on my Instagram, I always encourage people to, try out different methods of play with yourself, like try out different modes of masturbation. But it doesn't even have to be about trying to bring yourself to orgasm or anything like that. Like, just finding out, like, what you do want to feel during sex and what you don't want to feel. It could even just be like running your hands over your body and finding out, like, what parts of my body, when I'm touching myself like this, ignite something in me that I want to keep going on this kind of sexual journey, whatever you want to call it. And I think that that is an essential part of finding out, again, what your needs are, what your desires are, stuff like that, and being able to communicate that to your partner whenever the time comes. Because if you don't know what you like, you're not going to be able to tell your partner what you like. It's as simple as that. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
100% agree. I wanted to sort of kind of swing back to something that Danielle just mentioned that I think was really important, is that inviting the idea or the experience of self-pleasure into this conversation, I think, is really central. And also understanding that there is so much shame around self-pleasure, right? And self-play and even self-exploration, right? And so giving permission for that to even happen is so crucial, and it's so it's just so essential. Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and then even just the cultural message that and I think that this exists, or this message exists for women in particular, that our sexuality exists to be in service to another person, right? And so then the message around self-pleasure is completely, void at that point, right? Like, we're not even allowed to engage in self-pleasure because sex is not for us. Sex is for someone else, right? And so again, challenging that message really creates an access point for us to do consent fully, enthusiastically, ethically, in a really pleasure-centered way. So thanks, Danielle, for bringing that in, because it really is the center. It really is.
Of course. And something else I wanted to add, something I thought of while you were talking, I just want to take the moment to, like, normalize self-exploration and self-pleasure even when you're in a relationship, because I know that there is a huge stigma for people in relationships and thinking that because your partner is masturbating or taking part in any kind of self-pleasure or any kind of pleasure that doesn't involve your other partner is kind of like a slight to your partner, or like you're trying to say that you don't want to have sex with them, or that, having sex with them isn't enjoyable, so you'd rather just do it yourself. And that could not be further from the truth. Granted, there are situations where that may be true, but I think a lot of the time people assume that that's an issue, and they kind of create an issue where there isn't one. So I just wanted to take the time to kind of just normalize the fact that it is totally okay to engage in self-pleasure and exploration. It's kind of a continuous journey just for yourself, whether you're with someone or you're not with someone. It's not an insult to your partner. It's not saying that, your partner isn't good enough or not satisfying you. It's okay for self-exploration to just be something completely for the self.
Well, just to that point, I mean, having a second, third, fourth, however many people, having another person part of the sexual experience is not a prerequisite to sex, right? And so it really is, because baby, let me tell you, the sex I have with myself is different than the sex I have with somebody else. It's just different. And I think that sort of kind kind of circles back to something we mentioned earlier in terms of embracing the diversity of sexual expression, right? That, multiple partner or partnered sex is just a variation of sexual expression, just like solo sex is a variation. Using toys or different apparatus, that is another form of expression, right? And so I think that we're sort of dispelling the normative expectations around sex, that sex is supposed to look this way, and or acceptable sex rather looks one way, right? And so I think that part of this, part of consent is just agreeing that we can expand our idea of what we think about sex, how we feel, generating different feelings and sensations in different parts of our body, and really kind of taking all of those things to sort of be part of how we identify sexually. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you bring up a point of like, yeah, there's kind of like this script, I feel like, at least in the culture that we're in. Again, we can't really speak to other cultures since we don't live in them. But there's this expectation of like, this is what sex is supposed to look like. And it is a heteronormative lens too. And it's a monogamous lens too. So just want to uplift that, like, it looks a lot of different ways. And it's very diverse. So that brings in like LGBTQ plus sex positivity and all that stuff too. That's always, yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head as always. So I appreciate having this conversation with you both.
I just wanted to add one more thing, something else that came up when Dr. Norman was talking about like how the sex that you have with yourself looks different than the sex that you have with other people. And that just made me realize like there's something so empowering about being able to just like get turned on by yourself. Like I personally feel like no one can turn me on the way I do.
Nobody.
And seriously. And I think that's one of the most empowering things about like what I can bring to the table when it comes to having sex with other people. And just to touch on my point that I made before about how like just because you're in a relationship doesn't mean that you can't masturbate or self-pleasure. People don't realize like being able to like have those moments of self-exploration and being able to self-pleasure, that's going to make partnered sex a lot better because you're going to be able to communicate exactly what it is that you want. You're not going to waste time with allowing your partner to do something that doesn't feel good. So it's just going to enhance the experience for both of you, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So.
I was going to say, can I add to the conversation around communication, right? So I think like Danielle, you segued nicely into the importance of doing this type of exploration so that it kind of gives us access to better communication. And how your body responds in different situations. Those are things that we should be telling our partner, right? That when you touch me here, it feels like this. When you touch me here, it feels like this, right? I'm also really big on even just like sharing with other people, like how you sound during sex, right? Maybe some of the things that you say or things that you don't want said during sex, right? Like there could be some words, phrases that you're like, that's not going to work. But then there are other phrases that you might want to hear that really contribute to your arousal and the overall experience. And so one, knowing what those things are is important, but then also being able to have that discussion and just sort of share and make that conversation fun, right? It doesn't have to feel like clinical and like really dry and rigid. Just like make it fun. Talk about it over coffee, make it awkward in public places for everyone else, or just make that part of like the, I don't know, just like it should be a conversation that happens over time as well, right? It shouldn't just be like, we ready to get it done. Let me just run through my top 10. It's like, that's not going to work, right? We need to kind of plan it and be a little more intentional around us sort of cultivating this level of connection, right? That rush stuff you're not going to get a full experience. I'm all about low and slow. I don't want to have a microwave sexual experience where you just put me on add 30 seconds and expect things to pop off. Like, it's not going to work like that. So I prefer more of a discussion. I prefer externally processing those things. Also, the nonverbal cues are important as well, right? So telling them what your face is going to look like when you are experiencing pleasure, or what it looks like when you reach a pleasure threshold or pain, right? I like using the word pleasure threshold instead of pain because that's kind of subjective. But you do want to be able to communicate discomfort, right? Like, what is your body doing when it feels uncomfortable? Or using gestures to sort of communicate discomfort or threshold. So being able to simply put your hand up with your palm facing your partner to let them know, I need you to stop, or I need you to slow down, or I need you to back up. Or sometimes you could use both of your hands, crossing them in front of you and backing away, right? That can also communicate that you would require some distance in that situation. But all of those cues should be discussed ahead of time. So when they come up in a sexual encounter, it's not mysterious, it's not confusing. You've already let them know, this is how I communicate a boundary. And so I think that dialogue is definitely a necessary one that can help reduce harm.
I love that. And I wanted to circle back on a word that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which was awkward. And then you brought it up again. I just want to normalize that, sex isn't going to be a certain way all the time. Like, there will be trial and error, and like kind of normalizing that conversation too. Sometimes, people don't get to where they were hoping to get, things like that. And so just being able to have that conversation too, and understand and kind of take away the shame of that too. Because I think that there's this idea that sex is always going to look like this. Sure. And it doesn't. So I don't know if you have anything you wanted to hop in on that, or if that made sense at all.
Yeah, no, that makes complete and total sense. I mean, I think one of the primary ways that we can sort of deprogram ourselves is to be a bit more realistic around our porn consumption, because porn will really mess up, your expectations in terms of what is realistic and what is not, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's important for us to always understand that porn is performative, right? And so it is not reality. And so and porn is also a production, right? And so everything is very scripted, everything is timed, things are removed, redone, sped up, and so chopped up, moved in different places. And so
edited out.
Edited out completely, exactly. And so it's like, and also understanding that with porn being performative, it is what I call like forward facing, right? Meaning that it's on stage, not backstage, right? And there's so much about sex and intimacy that is a backstage experience, right, that should be happening before we do our, the main performance, if you will, right? And so, and I think that if we look to porn for education rather than entertainment, it really does negatively skew our perceptions and our expectations of what sex should be.
Right. Definitely. You definitely said it a lot more eloquently than how I was trying. I love it. And, speaking about this self-exploration to figure out kind of what keeps us safe and keeps us aroused as well, or whatever we're looking for in the sexual encounter. Let's say a survivor of trauma gets triggered during play. So how could they go about communicating this to their partner?
I think some of the nonverbal cues that Dr. Norman mentioned earlier will probably come into play here, which is why having that conversation is so important beforehand. So, just letting your partner know ahead of time, like, if I put my hand up like this, that means I want you to stop. Or if you see me kind of like backing away from you, or if you feel that I'm closing my legs more instead of opening them, then that's a sign that I would like for us to pause. And especially if you don't feel as comfortable saying, hey, can we stop? that's where those nonverbal cues are really going to come in handy. But of course, I think everyone should feel empowered to actually say, hey, I'm feeling XYZ in this moment. Can we pause? Can we just take a break? I'm not feeling comfortable. I'm feeling like I need to regroup a little bit. So I think it's also one of those things that's easier said than done, which is why consent and ongoing consent and consent beforehand is so important to instill in people. So.
Yeah, I was thinking too. I think that those are all really great tips, and I appreciate you saying like it's easier said than done when I talk about boundaries and things like that. It does take practice, and that's okay because we're not taught how to do it. But we should normalize that. But also, do you find, because while we're doing like this self-exploration for someone who has gone through trauma, maybe there might be a trigger that surprises them during play with someone else. So how can they communicate that when it's kind of comes out of nowhere and they were kind of surprised by it?
So I think, again, I'm going to come back with the acronyms because that's how I roll. So how we sort of talked about the self-unifying negotiation, in contrast to SUN, I like to use the mindfulness approach called RAIN, RAIN. And so RAIN stands for recognize, acknowledge, investigate, and nurture. And so I think that when things, like you said, come up that are unexpected, right? That we thought we negotiated things and we thought we were clear, and maybe we were absolutely clear, but then something comes up, right? Some sensation that we weren't expecting, we aren't really sure how to navigate, or maybe it rubbed up against a wound that we weren't really anticipating. Using this sort of mindfulness approach kind of slows everything down, right? And so the goal is to help regulate the sympathetic nervous system, which will probably get activated when we are triggered, right? So that sends us into that we've perceived a threat, even if there is not a intentional or clear threat. Nevertheless, that is how we are interpreting that, right? And so by the first one, recognize, that's for everybody, right? That's for both partners. That's just not for the triggered partner. That is for the secondary or other partners that are involved. Is sort of recognize that there is some misalignment, right? So recognize that there is someone who is feeling uncomfortable or someone who is feeling misaligned, in their body in some sort of way, right? And then through that, after that recognition, then we have to acknowledge that that's what's happening, right? So we have to either say, oh, I moved you, I changed your position, and that made you cower or withdraw from me, right? Or I was applying too much impact, right? In that particular way, or I touched you on the back of your neck, and that made you recoil from me, right? So there has to be some acknowledgement, and that requires accountability, right? On the people that are involved, right? And then the next one is sort of investigation, and that's where we can sort of dig a little bit deeper to figure out what is the source of the trigger, right? Is it a sensation, something that we're reacting to? Or is it symbolic, right? So I think it should be noted that triggers can be both a sensation or they can be symbolic. Sensation meaning that, say somebody is applying some impact with a paddle or something like that, right? And the act of applying that pressure to that body part creates a negative reaction from a sensation, right? It's just the implement on the skin created a sensation that didn't feel good. That's what I mean by a sensational trigger. And that thing could be connected to a memory or something else, right? Symbolic can mean that the situation or the context of the interaction feels uncomfortable, right? So if someone has had a negative experience with a person of a certain personality or stature or something like that, right? And then maybe they feel overpowered in some way, that it's not that the person is doing anything, it's just there's a symbolic nature that is sort of conjuring up a negative memory, right? In BDSM, I've heard of this happening in even more extreme ways, right? Because there's a lot of other sort of implements involved. And sometimes it's like the partner, right? Or sometimes being in interracial dynamics can feel uncomfortable, right? And so it's not like the individual person, it's kind of the situation. So my point is that context and moods have to be discussed as part of the consent process as well, right? So having different objectives. So saying one person is expecting a deep and a sensual experience while another person is expecting something aggressive can lead to very different outcomes, right? And that misunderstanding is going to lead to harm, right? And so that's part of that investigation process that we have to sort of reassess, where did we go awry? You know what I'm saying? Like, where did we go left and I went right? We have to sort of figure out where we went wrong. And then nurturing, it's just being present, and applying grace and showing some compassion for this person's experience, right? All of those things together will then lead to either that looks like stopping completely, that might look like just stopping whatever that act is and maybe switching it for something a little different. It might be changing a sensation, right? So if there was a sort of an acute pain sensation, we might want to use maybe a soft blanket or something to contrast that sort of acute pain to something that's a little more soft and nurturing on the body, right? So that's what that nurture looks like. But I think RAIN is a little mindfulness thing that I just think it really creates accountability and intentionality around our response, right? And I think that if we can respond in a very mindful and a very somatic kind of way, then we can sort of mitigate, right, some of the outcome of being triggered, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that you said, and I love that acronym. And whenever we talk about triggers, a lot of times we say like, know your triggers and share them, but we don't really talk about how the other person should also get to know the other person's triggers, and they're kind of held accountable in that sense too, just getting to know together in that sense. And then also kind of in that investigation piece, I feel like, again, that's why sex positivity is super important, because that piece has to happen with that accountability. And if there's a sense of shame of even talking about sex, but also maybe having an experience that you weren't expecting because you always have this idea in your head of how it should go, then people may shy away from this conversation because of the shame of whatever, right? And so I'm seeing how like all of these pieces are super important for us to come together as in a sex positive way. I think there's also a myth that communicating consent can actually ruin the mood. You were talking about moods, Dr. Norman. So how would you go about addressing this myth, and what are ways that consent can actually be really sexy?
Well, psychology helps us sort of dispel the myth, right? So the psychology of anticipation really says that sort of talking about what is going to happen, or even making some intentional plans or having discussions, that level of anticipation, knowing what to expect, actually breeds desire, right? And that generates dopamine, right? And we know that dopamine helps stimulate our arousal and it causes excitement. And so I always feel like the people who say that have like never really communicated or like try to generate some anticipation, because it's nice, right? Or I would also say side eye to the people who say that anticipation is a buzzkill, are probably doing sex for the wrong reasons, right? And so those folks are probably people that are exploiting power in some sort of way, right? And so those are people that want that element of surprise that you were talking about, Emilie, right? And remember, surprise can generate two feelings. It can either generate a threat, right? Or it can generate an opportunity, right? But if you are trying to go for the element of surprise and generating some level of fear in somebody or a lack of control in somebody, then yeah, talking about it ahead of time would be a buzzkill, right? But again, that can be deciphered through discussing the objective of the interaction in the first place, right? And usually people that seek to overpower and dominate without any consent are probably not going to be willing to engage in that conversation. They're not going to be willing to say, hey, you know what? I want to sneak up behind you and, you know, X, Y, and Z. But I think that in situations where that's not the case, I do think that the communication can really actually enhance the experience. I really think that even people who, and I would actually encourage this for survivors of trauma, that even like scheduling sex, right? That can help take away some of the fear that can be associated with anticipation or the not knowing, that if you just go ahead and just schedule, and it doesn't have to be scheduling sex, it could be scheduling intimacy, right? Like going on a date, right? Like just generating some romance and just sort of understanding how the night is going to go, that builds trust, right? Within the dyad or within the group. And so I'm definitely a big fan of sharing your plans, right? And also by sharing the plans, you get the chance to make them better, right? I mean, there's no fun. No one has a play. We don't just write the script and go do the play, right? We write it, we let it breathe, we talk about it, we say, ooh, why don't we add some of this in here? That might, you know, be fun. And so I think that there is really is an opportunity through that communication. It doesn't need to be a negative or a spoiler.
And just to piggyback off of that, it just got me thinking about, you know, how we communicate on dating apps. Like, I love asking the question, like, what are you into? Because I think that that kind of just opens the door to a conversation about consent. You can kind of feel out the person before you even meet them, see if you're even compatible sexually. And maybe that's going to help you figure out whether or not you're wasting your time with this person. And I think, you know, especially when you hit it off with that kind of conversation, when you really get the ball rolling, like getting into like dirty talk and all that kind of stuff, I think that's kind of a way to just breed intimacy between the two of you, whether it's going to be like a casual thing or a one-time thing or whatever. I think it's always good to have those conversations just so there's no kind of like mystery surrounding your sexual compatibility and stuff like that. You can find out what the person isn't into right off the bat, so you don't, you know, make any missteps when you actually are about to have sex with each other. And that conversation, again, it can be continuous. So, you know, when you finally do hang out with each other, you can keep the idea of consent present just by saying like, oh, so I remember you saying you're into this, or would you mind if I tried that thing that we talked about, or you know what I mean? So I think there are definitely ways to make and keep consent sexy. And something else I thought of, again, going back to dating apps, because I feel like there are a lot of people, mostly men on these dating apps, who kind of present themselves as like a dom. And they think that just because they like it rough, that means that they're a dom. But when you ask them about like aftercare, they like look at you like you're crazy, or they'll unmatch you. So I think that's why it's a good idea to have those conversations early, because you're going to weed out, you know, people who may have intentions that don't align with yours.
Yeah, and I think that having the conversations can be really empowering too. And asking the questions about your needs and desires and theirs as well. And yeah, I think that couldn't agree more. I'm so glad you brought up dating apps, because I think that's how a majority of people are meeting now. So it's important to talk about them. You know, you talked earlier about how consent, you know, we were talking about it from like a sexual standpoint, but how can consent go beyond sex? What about kind of like this decision-making power, things like that?
I would say that I think consent, it definitely goes beyond sex, and I think it starts very young. We don't realize what we're teaching our kids about consent. Like, when you're at a family function, like, oh, you haven't seen this cousin in forever, go give them a hug. Like forcing a kid to give someone a hug, you don't realize that that's kind of taking away their decision-making power. Or even like allowing your kids to feel empowered to speak up to you as the parent when you do something that hurts them. I grew up in a household where, back talk was discouraged. And, there's good sides to that and there's bad sides to that, because there are times when I think that maybe I should bite my tongue on certain things, like even now as an adult. And it just makes me think back to, where did that come from? It starts very, very young. So I think that that's something that we could be a little more conscious about when it comes to raising our kids, just like making sure that we're doing things to let them know that they do have power over themselves and their bodies, especially.
Danielle, you said something called back talk. So can you lean more into that as far as, is that like when a child is saying like, I'm not okay with this or something like that?
Yeah, so especially like, and of course, this is a very nuanced kind of thing, but maybe you have an argument with your child, or maybe like you say something to your child that they don't like, and if they start to voice that they don't like it, then it's considered talking back, or it's considered disrespectful. And of course, there are times when kids can be a little disrespectful, but I just remember, specific things in my own experiences where I was really just trying to tell my parent, you hurt my feelings. So just to have that shut down so quickly without any kind of discussion, that's kind of sticks with the person, and we don't think about the ways that it can bleed into other aspects of a person's life. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more about also that, teaching consent early to children, as far as they have a right to their bodies, they have a right to not want to hug this person, not want to give grandma or grandpa a kiss, that kind of thing. Absolutely. So I'm so glad that you brought that up into this conversation. So we talked a lot about how we kind of danced around the word empowerment, right? And so how can sex positivity be empowering, and how can it be especially empowering for survivors and individuals that identify as BIPOC?
I think that when sort of to backpack off of the decision making power, people who hold privilege in certain spaces are granted the power to define the mood, define the vibe, define the language, the attire, the topic of conversation, and who gets to do what, and they get to sort of decide how all of those decisions get made, right? And so when an individual is marginalized or part of a marginalized people group, they get sort of relegated to the outside, which reduces the amount of space they are able to occupy. And so, particularly for BIPOC, who socially just have less decision-making power, being able to make decisions and to, withdraw or to talk back or speak up, right? Or even just show up as themselves in any space is an opportunity for them to expand their power and their ability, expand their lived experience, right? And I think that by reducing this, the shame reduction that we've been talking about, and just sort of getting to know ourselves and what we are entitled to and what we are worthy of, that for me, I hope that survivors, I hope that BIPOC folks, people who have systematically been denigrated and used or exploited, I feel like there is an opportunity for us to shift out of that, to kind of stand a little more firmly in who we are, and being okay with all of those things, right? And so I think that at least some of the concepts that we've talked about today can really expand their lived experience overall, right? I mean, just enhance their psychological health, their quality of life, and how they sort of move through the world, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dr. Norman. And I love that you kind of bring up this just the overarching empowerment and bringing in also the importance of understanding, things like systemic racism and things like heteronormativity and just systems in general are important to kind of bring up into this conversation as always, and the intersectionalities of those identities and things like that. Going back to kind of this decision-making power when it comes to consent, what would you say to someone who believes that they actually owe someone sex?
I would say that they absolutely do not owe anybody sex, and anyone who tells you that you do, they're attempting to control you. I mean, whether they will admit it or not, whether they know it or not, that's where that comes from. You never owe anybody anything, especially not sex.
Period.
Yeah, I think that there can be this kind of misconception that, if something's, a gift is given or a certain date is lengthy or something like that, or even if they have given like focused pleasure to you, I think that there can be this pressure to give the focused pleasure back. But I think it's important that at any point, you don't owe anyone, especially sex, you don't owe anyone that. So again, kind of pulling away that idea of like social scripts that we've been kind of taught as a society here, super important to break down. So we talked about consent aftercare. So what exactly is that? And also, how does it relate to talking about triggers and, those who have gone through trauma, things like that?
Yeah, so aftercare in general, it's most frequently used within the BDSM community and that culture. And it's a very, it's an expected part of sexual engagement. And it's sort of this reflective period after sort of the main event, if you will, when there's sort of been an agreement that the play has come to a conclusion. And then this is sort of like the post-play period, right? And this is where you are able to receive different things that are going to sort of support your transition from sort of a high dopamine space into back to your baseline, right? So the point from sort of from a neurological standpoint, the point of aftercare is to sort of regulate your serotonin levels, right? So it's naturally what goes up must come down, right? So you sort of have a cerebral drop, if you will. And so aftercare is considerate of that natural neurological process that happens. It is supportive of the come down, and it is there to provide you with things that are going to ease that transition. So what that can look like is sometimes it's conversations, right? Checking in, asking how that experience was for everyone involved, right? Talk about what you liked, talk about what didn't, maybe you don't want to try that again. But being able to sort of communicate what happened, that's also important so that you know that everybody's on the same page, right? That what I think happened is also what you thought happened, right? And so having, again, knowing that that consent is continuous, we're still sort of checking in that we're having a mutual and shared experience, right? It can also look like just meeting some physical needs as well. So nourishment is oftentimes part of the aftercare experience. So rehydrating, eating body sustaining foods, foods that are going to be energizing for you. Sometimes it could also be physical in terms of physical touch, right? But then also there are other people that don't like any physical touch, right? And that should be communicated, right? So when your partner rolls over and they don't want to be bothered, like you don't want to get your feelings hurt. So it's important to sort of have that discussion ahead of time so you can anticipate, oh, this person needs a little bit of space afterwards, right? I think that, however, there should be some commitment of reconnecting at the end at some point, even if it's not immediate, but just communicate that it shouldn't be indefinite. You shouldn't be walking away from the experience not knowing what's going on or if you're going to see them again. So sometimes there could be like an immediate process, or sometimes it could be like, I'll text you a little bit later tonight, or I'll text you in the morning to see how you're feeling. That type of follow up, I think, is really important, and it brings that nurturing aspect to the engagement.
That's such a good point, Dr. Norman. When I talk about kind of communication skills and things like that, and communication tips for healthy relationships, one of the things I always bring up is there's this concept of kind of the silent treatment and how that can be really damaging. And at the same time, if someone does need space, however, because of maybe they're talking and they're like, you know what, I need some time to process this on my own, they have every right to do that, of course. And they should, maybe communicate that with the person that they're talking to, like, hey, I'm going to check in. And it sounds like this could be like the same kind of concept, just applied in this kind of realm. I don't know if you have anything you wanted to jump in on, Danielle.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of a point Dr. Norman made about, kind of having a conversation during the aftercare process of what happened, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I think that invites an opportunity to maybe talk about any triggers that might have come up. You can make sure that you were able to talk about it, so you don't feel that there was no opportunity to talk about it, or that things kind of just went unsaid. I think when you're having that conversation about, well, this is what I perceived happening, that allows the other person to be like, well, I understand that that's what you thought was happening, but I just want to let you know this is what I was experiencing in that moment. And it doesn't have to be like a combative thing. It doesn't have to be an accusatory thing. It's just bringing awareness to what I felt versus what you felt, and how we can move forward from there, or maybe talk about how to avoid that happening again, or how to make sure that you're both on the same page in the future. So.
I think I also want to add that, similar to how we were talking about that myth that communication isn't sexy, I think that myth can sometimes be attributed to what we're talking about right now, is that like, oh, I don't want to, that's so unsexy to sit there and process, but it's really not. I've actually had clients do this, and they've reported back that they really enjoyed it, that they, it's maybe a little awkward in the sense that it's maybe not what you normally do, but they found it to be really informative and really understanding the experience of the other person. So it's definitely, I think it's a necessary component, and you can make it romantic as well, right? And so like your aftercare could look like, a nice hot cup of chamomile tea, and, maybe a candle and some soft music or some ambient sounds to help, and you all can just sort of sit under a blanket together and just sort of have this really intimate kind of conversation where you're still finding an opportunity to connect, right? And if you sort of like frame it in that way, opposed to more of a task, you know what I mean? Then I think it is something that can be integrated very easily into couples' experiences.
I love that. That makes me feel very cozy, the way that you described that, especially on this really rainy day. But I love that it can be, it can look however you want it to look. And that can be in and of itself empowering as well. We've been talking a lot about how sex positivity can help combat rape culture. So how can it? And then what can we all do to promote sex positivity and take away that shame that contributes to rape culture?
For me, what comes to mind when I'm thinking about how sex positivity can kind of help combat rape culture, I think that really speaks to education. Just comprehensive sex education is very, very needed in our society, especially. But that's why I always encourage people to do their research about consent, do their research about like the body, how the body reacts to certain stimulus, how the body reacts when it's aroused. The fact that just having a physical reaction to stimulation does not mean that you're consenting. And I think that empowers people to be able to, well, hopefully it empowers people to be able to speak up, especially if they find themselves in a situation where they feel like they want to say no, but maybe they can't because of what their body's showing or what their body's doing, or just for whatever reason. So I really do think that sex education is very, very needed if we want to help combat rape culture. And then on top of that, going back to what we were talking about before about porn and how porn should be used for entertainment purposes versus educational purposes, because we have a lot of people out here who will watch a certain porn scene and they'll think that just because they're seeing a person enjoying themselves, that means that if they go out into the real world and do that exact same thing to a person without asking first or without talking about it, that they, number one, know what they're doing, and number two, that they're giving a person this mind-blowing experience when that may not be the case. And I really do think that if we stop looking to porn for education, we would realize that sex in real life is not always what we see on the screen. Maybe we could avoid certain missteps and mistakes when it comes to actually having sex with a person. And of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to reenact what you see in a porn, or excuse me, in a porn scene. But there's something wrong when you just assume that that is what a person wants because that's like a really popular scene online or something like that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that that's, it goes without saying that everyone is, different. And so having that communication is super key. And, that sense of accountability that we were talking about earlier too is super important as well. How else can we, like, as individuals, help combat rape culture with sex positivity? Is there anything else you want to bring up, Danielle or Dr. Norman?
I think that one of the things, just from a systemic kind of cultural, patriarchal kind of framework, is that I think that we often think of consent being one-sided, that somebody initiates something and then the other person is consenting to that other person, right? Like we think about it in that kind of sense. And I don't think we give enough attention and accountability to the initiator, if we can kind of put some quotes around that. But this is just sort of to re-emphasize that bilateral piece, right? Each person needs to be consenting to what's going on, right? It's not just a give and take situation. Again, that requires us to sort of disrupt this narrative of what we think sex looks like, or the process or procedure protocol for what sex is supposed to look like, which is very linear, right? It's very top-down approach. It's one person sort of submitting to another person. And if we instead look at sex in a more mutual way, right? That everybody needs to be communicating, not just if you perceive yourself on a receiving end. It's not just up to you to talk about what it is that you like or don't like. It's also the responsibility of the other person to really communicate what it is that they like and what they don't like. I think that there should be vulnerability and openness when initiating and negotiating sex or intimacy. There should not be force, right? In that initiation or in that conversation, right? So if anybody finds themselves trying to get their way or impose their needs on other people, or if you feel like your needs aren't being considered, that's not it. Like, you doing sex wrong, right? I mean, it's really about having mutual discussions, equitable discussions about sex. And that should never feel intimidating or pressuring, right? Everyone should come to the table open, honest, vulnerable, and willing to listen. And I think that if we were able to normalize that approach, then I think that that could really help engage in sex in a more positive way.
Definitely. And just want to reiterate too that if anyone ever feels as if there was some coercion and their consent was ever violated in any way, you always have support. The VSC is always here. Reach out. We have that 24-hour helpline, 407-500-HEAL. I always like to point that out. And then at the beginning and end of my podcast, I always, share that hotline to the National Hotline as well. But please reach out if you ever felt like your consent was violated. You're not alone. And there's people here to chat with you about that. As a final kind of question here, you talked about education being really important. So where would you kind of suggest someone can go if they want to learn more either about sex therapy or consent or anything like that? Any kind of places that you would want to uplift as a final question, or anything that you want to say that we may not have covered?
I think as far as sex education, it's not a secret that sex education is not regulated, and at least in our country, it's not regulated. It's not even like a law that sex education has to be like accurate and consent focused and stuff like that. So unfortunately, sometimes you do have to kind of dig a little deeper and look to other resources. So I think that there is a pretty strong community of, consent conscious and sex positive educators on Instagram. I consider myself one of them. It's a small community, but we are really dedicated to making sure that people have accurate information and that it's not just based on abstinence and STI prevention. A lot of pages that talk explicitly about pleasure and consent and gender and talking to your kids about sex. So the one page that is sticking out to me right now is Sex Positive Families, because they really do try to take an approach for people to be able to talk to their kids about sex and consent and like starting those conversations early. But if you go on Instagram, like if you were to look at my Instagram, you could easily find other pages and people that are talking about the same things that I'm talking about, because we're so tight knit. It's such a small community. Like we're always tagging each other or reposting each other's stuff. So once you like find one page on Instagram that talks about it, you're bound to find the rest of the pages.
That's so awesome. Thank you, Danielle. I think that's super important for, I want to uplift that. Definitely. I hope the community grows, and I love that you all are supporting each other. Dr. Norman, is there any kind of final thoughts that you have before we sign off?
Well, I would like to co-sign Danielle's a sex pot therapist community online. It is legit and it is important and it is necessary. And so I think that finding those spaces, right, and finding those educators that really speak your language, that really help you understand and you to kind of just know yourself a little more intensely, I think is really crucial. I think that for me, some of the work that I do, particularly with ethnic and sexual minorities, is I'm always really interested in helping people explore like their kinks safely, right? I think that non-normative sexual expression is something that I want other people to learn more about, right? And I want people to feel that their sexuality is expansive, right? That it is not just one thing. And I also really just, I'm all about generating pleasure. I just don't think that we talk about it enough in our culture around sex in particular. So, I'm advocating for more fun and more play, right? And just really learning about the different sensations that arouse you that aren't even sexual, right? Just like knowing what your favorite food is, what smells, really kind of uplift your mood, and just the feeling of exerting yourself physically, right? Like your niece and nephew around the playground or something, or, just feeling that sense of joy and laughter and community and connection, all of those things I think we need more of, right? Because that helps us learn our bodies more. It expands our understanding of our sensational experiences, our physical sensations, and our mental stimulus. And so I'm all about just finding ways to generate more of that. If I did have a resource to point listeners to, is a book called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. The subtitle is The Politics of Feeling Good. And I think that it is an essential text for sexual liberation.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Danielle and Dr. Norman, once again for being on today. I learned so much from you both.
Thank you.